The eviction notice was still warm from the printer when Daniel Hargrove slid it under his daughter's door. He stood in the hallway of the house he'd paid for, built a life in, and watched his children grow up in for 31 years. The carpet was the same beige he'd chosen in 1993. The banister his late wife, Margaret, had painted white still bore the small chip near the bottom where his son, Colton, had crashed his bicycle into it at age 9. The walls remembered everything. And now, at 67 years old, Daniel was the one being forgotten within them. It had started 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like burnt coffee and bad news. The conversation that changed everything. Colton and his sister, Priya, she'd taken her husband's last name and become Priya Deshpande, which still sometimes took Daniel by surprise, had called a family meeting. They sat across from him at the kitchen table with the careful, practiced faces of people who had rehearsed this conversation in a car on the way over. Daniel noticed they hadn't brought the grandchildren. That was the first clue. "Dad," Colton began, turning a coffee mug in slow circles, "we've been talking and we think it's time to think about your future." Daniel had waited. He was good at waiting. 30 years of engineering had taught him that the most important information usually came after the longest silence. "We've found a place," Priya said, sliding a brochure across the table. "Pinecrest Senior Living. It's in Scottsdale. Really beautiful, Dad. Walking trails, a pool, an activity center." "A place," Daniel repeated. "It's not what it sounds like," Colton said quickly. "It's independent living. You'd have your own apartment. You'd be around people your own age." Daniel looked at the brochure. A silver-haired man beamed at him from a photograph, holding a tennis racket with the enthusiasm of someone being paid to hold a tennis racket. The tagline read, "Your next chapter starts here." "And the house?" Daniel asked. Priya and Colton exchanged that look. The look siblings develop when they've already made a decision and are now simply delivering a verdict. "We thought we'd sell it," Priya said. "Split the proceeds 3 ways, you'd get your share for the Pinecrest deposit and living expenses. It's actually a really smart financial move, Dad. The market is." "When did you decide this?" Daniel asked. Another look. "A few months ago," Colton admitted. A few months? They had been planning this for months. While Daniel had been cooking Sunday dinners for them, watching the kids in the backyard, fixing Colton's leaking bathroom faucet in November, they had been meeting without him, making decisions about his life, packaging him up neatly for Scottsdale. He picked up the brochure. He set it down. He poured himself more coffee, even though he didn't want any. "So," he said calmly, "you're going on a cruise." Priya blinked. "What?" "The two of you, you've planned a cruise for yourselves and decided where I'm going to live. The house, my house, will be sold. My things, I assume, will be reduced to what fits in a Scottsdale apartment." He took a sip of coffee. "It sounds like a cruise. You've handled all the logistics. All I have to do is show up at the dock." Colton opened his mouth, closed it. "We thought you'd be relieved," Priya said quietly. Daniel looked at his daughter, this brilliant, beautiful woman he had coached through AP chemistry, driven to college orientation, walked down an aisle. He looked at his son, this broad-shouldered man who had cried in his arms after his first divorce and learned to grill a steak in this very backyard. "I'm going to need some time to think," Daniel said. He thought for exactly 72 hours. The decision. Margaret had died 4 years ago, and in the excavation of grief that followed, Daniel had discovered something alarming. He had no idea who he was without the architecture of his life holding him up. Without a wife to love, children to raise, an office to report to, he was a load-bearing wall that had been removed from the building. The house still stood, technically, but something fundamental had shifted. He had spent 4 years waiting to feel normal again. Standing in the hallway after sliding the notice under Priya's door, he realized that waiting was what had gotten him into this mess. He had waited to grieve properly, waited to figure out what retirement looked like, waited for his kids to need him again, waited for life to come back and tap him on the shoulder. Instead, life had sent Colton and Priya with a brochure about a man holding a tennis racket. The notice he'd slid under the door wasn't a legal eviction. He'd thought about that briefly, then dismissed it as petty. It was simpler than that. It was a letter. 3 pages, written longhand on the good stationery Margaret had kept in the secretary desk. He told them he loved them without reservation. He told them he understood their concern and that he forgave them for going about it the wrong way. He told them they were right that the house should be sold, but that the proceeds were going to him entirely, per the deed, which had been in his name alone since 1991. He told them he was leaving. Not to Pinecrest Senior Living in Scottsdale. He was leaving to find out what 67 felt like when you stopped being careful about it. The house sold in 11 days. It was a seller's market, and the realtor, a sharp young woman named Tasha who wore blazers the color of confidence, said she'd never moved a property so quickly. Daniel signed the papers in her office on a Thursday afternoon, walked out with a cashier's check that made his hands feel strange, and drove to a diner where he ordered a patty melt and sat for 2 hours planning the rest of his life on a paper placemat. He had enough, more than enough. Margaret had been meticulous about their finances, and Daniel had honored her meticulousness after she was gone. The mortgage had been paid off since 2009. He had a pension, social security, and investments that had compounded quietly for decades like a polite secret. He was, by any reasonable measure, free. The journey begins. Daniel had never been to Portugal. He'd always meant to. Margaret had a print of Lisbon on the wall of her home office, those famous blue and white tiles, the terracotta rooftops, the way the city climbed its 7 hills like something inevitable. She'd torn it from a travel magazine in 1987 and framed it herself. After she died, Daniel couldn't bring himself to take it down, so it stayed on the wall of a room he rarely entered. He booked a one-way ticket. He told himself it was symbolic, but the truth was simpler. He didn't know when he was coming home, and he didn't think he should pretend otherwise. He arrived in Lisbon on a grey October morning, when the light fell soft and silver over the Tagus River. And the city smelled like salt water and espresso, and something older than he had words for. He'd booked a small apartment in Alfama, the old Moorish quarter, through an app his granddaughter had installed on his phone the previous Christmas. The apartment had terracotta floors, a single window that overlooked a narrow street, and a landlady named Dona Beatriz who was 79 years old and had opinions about everything. Dona Beatriz spoke almost no English. Daniel spoke almost no Portuguese. They got along magnificently. She brought him custard tarts and corrected his pronunciation of obrigado every morning until he got it right, which took 4 days. She introduced him to her friends, a rotating cast of older women who gathered in her apartment on Thursdays for what Daniel eventually understood was a combination card game, gossip session, and philosophical debate. They adopted him as a curiosity, and then gradually as a fixture. He stayed in Lisbon for 6 weeks. He walked until his feet ached and then walked more. He sat in squares and watched pigeons and read the books he'd been meaning to read for 20 years. He took a class in traditional Portuguese tile painting and made something so ugly that his instructor, a patient young man named Fabio, had to struggle visibly not to laugh. He went to fado concerts alone and let the music, mournful and gorgeous, and completely honest about the human capacity for longing, reach into the places inside him that had been closed off since Margaret died. He cried once in a restaurant, over a bowl of caldo verde soup, and the elderly waiter pretended not to notice and brought him a small glass of port without being asked. He called Colton from a hilltop, overlooking the city on a Sunday afternoon. "Dad, where are you?" Colton's voice was tight with something between worry and relief. "Lisbon," Daniel said. A long pause. "Portugal. Is there another one?" "Dad." "I'm fine, Colton, I'm better than fine." Daniel looked out at the river, the old city spilling down toward it like something poured from a great height. "I should have done this a long time ago. Your mother would have liked it here." What he found. From Lisbon, Daniel went to the Algarve, where the cliffs were orange and impossible, and the sea threw itself against them with cheerful violence. He rented a bicycle, the first time he'd been on one in 15 years, and promptly fell off it twice before finding his balance, which he decided was a reasonable metaphor for everything. Then Spain, then Morocco, which undid him completely in the best possible way, the Medinas and the spice markets, and the call to prayer echoing across rooftops at dawn, while he sat on a riad terrace drinking mint tea so sweet it made his back teeth ache. He spent 2 weeks in Marrakesh and left understanding less about the world than when he arrived, which his late wife had always said was the sign of a good trip. He met people. This surprised him most. He had always been sociable in the way of a man with a full life, friendly within the boundaries of routine, warm with people he already knew. Traveling alone at 67 stripped those boundaries away entirely. He shared meals with strangers and learned their stories. He met a retired schoolteacher from New Zealand named Harriet who was circumnavigating the globe on a fixed income and a titanium hip. He met a young Syrian man named Tariq who ran a guest house in the Atlas Mountains and told Daniel, over lamb tagine and a fire that snapped with cedar wood, about what it meant to love a place so much you stayed even when staying was hard. He started writing. Nothing formal, just notes in a small notebook he'd bought in a Lisbon bookshop, the kind of unguarded observation you only produce when there's no one watching. He wrote about the tiles and the light and the way old cities hold their history in their surfaces like tree rings. He wrote about Margaret. He wrote about Colton and Priya with a tenderness that surprised him, free from the bruise of the kitchen table conversation, understanding slowly that they had acted from love, even when the love was clumsy. He sent Priya a postcard from Morocco with a photograph of blue-painted buildings in Chef Chioyuan. On the back he wrote, "I'm not angry, I'm grateful. You pushed me out of a house and into a world. Love, Dad." She called him, crying, from a parking lot in Phoenix. The man who came back different. Daniel spent 7 months traveling. Portugal, Spain, Morocco, then a slow pivot east, Croatia, Montenegro, Greece. He wintered on a small island in the Cyclades where the population dropped to 400 in the off-season, and the taverna owner taught him to play backgammon with the focused intensity of someone passing down sacred knowledge. He turned 68 in Athens, alone at a table outside a restaurant in Monastiraki with a glass of wine and the Acropolis lit gold above the city. He took a photograph of himself and sent it to his grandchildren, who sent back a voice message that was mostly screaming, which he understood to mean they were pleased. He came home in May, tanned and lighter in a way that had nothing to do with weight. He flew into Phoenix because Colton and Priya were there, and he wanted to see their faces. They were waiting at arrivals, both of them, with the grandchildren holding a hand-drawn sign that said "Welcome Home Grandpa Adventurer" in crayon and glitter that was already migrating everywhere. He hugged them all for a long time. That evening at Priya's kitchen table, a different table, not his, which was right, over a dinner she'd cooked with the careful love of someone making amends, Daniel told them everything. The Fado concert, Dona Beatriz and the card games, falling off the bicycle in the Algarve, the mint tea, the backgammon, the night in Athens when he'd raised a glass to Margaret and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that she wasn't gone so much as ahead of him somewhere, waiting to hear about the trip. Colton listened with his head bowed. When Daniel finished, his son looked up with red eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, "about the way we did it." "I know," Daniel said, "and I meant what I told Priya. You pushed me, I needed pushing." He reached across the table and put his hand over his son's. "But from now on, we talk about these things, all of us together, deal?" Colton nodded, Priya nodded. Somewhere under the table, a grandchild was eating something from the floor, which Daniel decided not to address. The notebook. Daniel didn't move to Scottsdale. He bought a small house, his choice, his deed in Flagstaff, where the ponderosa pines made the air smell like something that preceded memory. It had a good desk and a room with good light, and that's where he sat most mornings, turning the cramped pages of 7 months of notebooks into something longer, something real. He wasn't sure yet if it was a book. Harriet from New Zealand, they had stayed in touch, trading emails across a 12-hour time difference, told him firmly that it was, and that he should stop being modest about it. He was 68 years old. He had a paid-off house, a grown family he talked to honestly now, and a story that belonged entirely to him. He had been left behind and had refused to stay left. He had been handed a horizon and walked straight into it. On his desk, in a new frame he'd bought in Lisbon from a market stall near the waterfront, was a photograph. Not Margaret's print of the tiled buildings, but a picture he'd taken himself, the Tagus River at dawn, all that silver light, the city climbing its hills in the background. Below it, in the careful handwriting of a man who'd learned to say what he meant, he'd taped a note to himself. It read, "You are not the end of anything. Keep moving." He was working on it.